Okay, so today on Approaching the Whiteboard, Jenn Ludgate's going to talk a little bit about curriculum and in particular curriculum design, and basically kind of what you've done as a strategy and what you think is kind of best practice in that area. So thank you for doing that, Jenn. Would you like to kind of start us off by telling us what it is that you've been doing at your school?
Of course, yes. So about 5 years ago now, when it came to light that the GCSEs were going to be changing, that there were obviously going to be needs for changes therefore in the curriculum to suit those new GCSEs. Being an English teacher, we were kind of stuck in the sense that we didn't know exactly what was going to come along. So we looked at mainly the headlines, if I'm honest with you, to try and find out what was going to be happening in those new GCSEs. And we decided to start by replanning the curriculum from year 7 all the way up through to year 11. I know a lot of schools started by replanning their curriculum just for year 10 and 11, which makes complete sense being the new GCSE. However, we decided, as many people have talked about before, that this is a long-term game. So we wanted to look at Key Stage 3 and then look at Key Stage 4. It helped that at the time I was Key Stage 3 coordinator, so that was actually all I could sort of do in that area. So we started to look at replanning the curriculum. We looked at lots of different theories, I suppose, behind curriculum planning. And really what it boils down to, and I think what we've learned over the last 3-4 years, and then redesigning the Key Stage 4 curriculum as well, is how all of these theories and practices and possible curriculum designs fit in with your school's ethos and your department's ethos. There's a huge amount of reading out there about how you should design a curriculum, how you should sequence the curriculum, what you should include in the curriculum. But really, none of that matters unless you know exactly what it is that you want your students to know, and what you expect them to go on to do and how you want them to enter the workplace. There's a lot of discussion at the moment about whether we should just be teaching purely knowledge, whether we should be teaching skills alongside it, whether we should consider more cultural capital, whether we should be considering teaching children more life skills. There's all these debates going on. We are now, and I am now, of the mind that actually it's a combination of those things that matter, and that you can create a curriculum that will if carefully constructed, can include all of those elements and fit with your ethos as well. So over the last 3 to 4 years, we've been working on changing our Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 curriculum to suit our particular school's needs.
Okay, so you made some big decisions there around cultural capital, what was significant, what would be useful for your year 7s to know in 5 years' time. And that was kind of your guiding principle around the whole thing. Okay, so that's pretty lofty as a start.
Yes, yeah.
I think that's important then. You mentioned sort of implicitly the idea, you listened explicitly what they're going to be, how this knowledge is going to impact them when they go out to the workforce, but also implicitly you sort of mentioned how they're going to kind of experience the subject and what you think the subject is, which I think is a really important thing to start with, actually. So once you've done that, what I think is really interesting, what I hope people will think is really interesting, is the way you went about that sort of collaboratively. And I just wondered if you could speak to us about that process, then how that was a collaboration as a department.
Certainly. So, when it started off, I have to be honest, it probably wasn't such a collaborative process, particularly when I was rewriting the Key Stage 3 curriculum. I worked closely with a couple of members of my department, or who are now my department, and we sort of quite literally had big sheets of paper and laid out all the different places and things that we think students should be using and learning and how they should be doing it. And that was quite a selfish process, I suppose, in the sense that I was rewriting it very much from my point of view. And at that point, I was actually only in my 3rd year of teaching. So I hadn't perhaps the knowledge and the expertise and not that I have that now, but the information that I now have 6 years in to make some of those decisions. So it did start off as quite an insular process. And I think curriculum planning can be very insular. Medium-term planning, lesson planning, you sometimes doing it completely on your own. And I think that's a dangerous place to be, because you can become either complacent and think that what you're doing is, you know, definitely correct and right for the students in front of you. And if you're not having those conversations with the experts around you, who are your fellow teachers, then that can be a very tricky path, because you can end up quite often repeating yourself, and you can end up doing the same thing year on year without questioning why you're doing it in that way. So something that changed, I suppose, was I started doing a lot more reading, and I started looking at all the different sort of alternative opinions, and the different, you know, formats behind curriculum design. And actually that made me question what I was doing, and whether or not I was doing things correctly. And I think that's the key thing to collaboration, is to first of all actually make sure you are talking to those members of your department who have been teaching for longer than you, who have been looking at things in a slightly different way, and take on board their opinions. When I became head of department last year, one of the very first things that we did was to look at the Key Stage 4 curriculum again, and we decided to make it a wholly collaborative process. And this was very much influenced, from my point of view, by the wonderful Freya O'Dell, who's on Twitter, and she talked a lot about collaborative planning. And I thought that actually the collaborative planning I've been doing so far were discussions in the staff room, were arguments every now and again in a meeting about why you would do something. They weren't particularly useful discussions, in the sense that there wasn't an outcome to them. So we decided to make our meetings, our department meetings over the year, about collaborative planning. We're very lucky in my school in that we have dedicated planning meetings. So we've got rid of a lot of these sort of whole staff meetings that we had when I started. Those have pretty much completely gone now. We're having a couple a year, and then every other meeting is either dedicated to planning in itself, or faculty meeting, which inevitably under me would turn into a planning meeting as well. So we're very lucky to have that dedicated time, and I think that's very important as a first step. If you're looking to replan the curriculum, you need time in order to do that, and you need to go and speak to the people who can give you the time to do that. This shouldn't be something, if you're going to replan just one unit, or even a series of lessons, or just one year group, for example, that's not something that you can do on top of everything else you're being asked to do successfully. So you need to speak to the people that matter, and say to them, look, we need the time to do that. And we're very lucky in my school that they've given us the time to replan the curriculum from top to bottom. And we were, I suppose, quite lucky in English that we were about a year ahead of the game, because we had to be with the implementation of the new GCSEs. So the collaborative planning basically came down to an initial meeting where we discussed our vision for the English department and how that fitted into the whole school's vision, the whole school's ethos. And that seems a strange starting point to plan a unit on Romeo and Juliet, but actually it really matters. We needed to agree on and decide on what mattered for our English department. And that's a work in progress. That's something that's still ongoing, that I'm still hoping to adapt over the years to come, our vision and what the department, you know, really stands for. Once you've decided, I think, upon those key things that matter to you, regardless of whether or not you decide that you're going to be a purely knowledge-based curriculum, or whether or not you're going to be use a curriculum that is, you know, as I've said previously, more interested in cultural capital or less interested in cultural capital than others, it doesn't really matter. It's what depends on your, you know, your particular school. Once you've done that, it was much easier to plan out what the successive meetings were going to be about. So we talked about Joe Kirby's blog in particular, which is about designing a knowledge-based unit in English. And in that blog, he sets out basically 7 key principles that he believes should be included in an English unit in order to make it successful. And although we are not a school and we're not a department that is purely knowledge driven, we agreed very much with those 7 things that should be included in a unit, in a lesson, in terms of curriculum planning. And that's something that I brought to the department and said to them, look, do we want to keep these 7 things here, or do we want to adapt them? Do we want to change them? Do we want to say something else should be included? but they are very good key principles, such as at the beginning of a unit, a lesson, recapping the prior knowledge. There is nothing there to disagree with, I don't think. Clearer explanations, which is something we're working on a lot within my department. Planning key questions, the key mastery skills that are going to be explored in that particular unit, how assessments are going to be formed, so the key assessments need to be decided in advance, and then of course any extension opportunities as well. So his blog was a real starting point for us, and the first thing I did was ask everyone to go away and read that blog in their own time, and then to come back a week later or 2 weeks later with their opinions and their thoughts on whether or not that suited our department. So I think the first thing about being collaborative is to give time, and the second most important thing is then to give people further time to come up with their own opinions and own views on it, because it's very hard to embed a curriculum that you don't believe in, and it's very hard to then go and teach those lessons if you haven't had any say or any input in them. And one thing I've found over the years is you can design the best lessons as far as you're concerned, and then you can walk into a classroom and see someone else teaching it, and it's completely different to how you have planned that lesson to come across. And sometimes that's brilliant, and people doing it far better and have come up with great ideas in order to do it, and sometimes it's far worse and it's not successful. So that element of collaboration has to be there from the start. I think there's sometimes confusion between collaboration and sharing, and those are two very separate different things, and therefore I think the time is the first element of that.
Yeah, and I mean, you've mentioned there about the collaboration of kind of sort of designing the curriculum, and one thing that I think you've kind of touched on here is which knowledge then, because obviously you're going to have to decide, well, you know, what techniques, something as simple as which techniques do we think are the most useful for our students?
Yeah.
You know, which ones should we start them off with in year 7? Could you talk to us a little bit about, because obviously there's a lot more to that, there's context, etc. How did you kind of define which knowledge was going to be the most useful for your students? And then how did you kind of break that down year by year? Did you give them it all at once, or was there a kind of a staggered approach to that? Could you talk to us a little bit about the decisions that were made around that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely a staggered approach. It's too big to suddenly start doing things straight away. So as I said, this has been a really long process so far, and it's not finished. But basically, we designed the original Key Stage 3 curriculum around sort of 3 strands, one for each year group. So we decided that year 7 was all about beginnings. So we kind of gave it that title. And from that, we were able then to draw out all the different elements that we decided we meant by beginnings. So we meant both beginnings of the history of language. So we start with the history of language. And then we meant the beginnings in terms of the basic plots. So how, you know, being 7 basic plots, you know, how to tell a story, what's included in a story, different types of storytelling. So we kind of came up with different titles, I suppose, for each year group that carefully linked together and built on top of each other. And then from that, we moved out all the basic strands. So again, that was very discussion based, and that was about 3 or 4 years ago now. And we've kind of stuck to those particular strands. So when we move into year 8, we talk a little bit more about the influence of literature. So we start to look at more precise periods of time. So we do move fairly chronologically through the eras. So we move on to the Victorians, the Romantics, and so on in those sort of groups. And again, we then decided from those points, right, what's the most important to come out of that. The way we did that originally is similar to how we do it now, but the way we did that originally is once we decided on the basic content, the basic knowledge, or rather not the basic knowledge, the overview of the knowledge that was needed, we then divided into groups of 2 or 3 in order to plan those units. And that was really how the process worked for the entirety of the Key Stage 3 curriculum. Groups of 3, discussing, talking, using that planning time to decide what the most important knowledge was. That was then brought back to the department, sort of shared and presented to the department so that any changes could be made beforehand. But that was an ongoing process. Obviously, starting with the ones that were most necessary and then working our way through. One problem I think that we found, again, was the issue with doing that is working in those groups of 3, although is really helpful, sometimes you would end up with mixes of teachers that perhaps were in complete agreement about what they were doing, which is great, but then you'd end up with quite a sort of singular and one-sided approach to something. So rather than having
there's something about that
input,
dissonance. There's something about that dissonance, isn't there, when you've got 2 people or even all 3 people who sort of have quite strong opinions and perhaps even disagree on some elements that they're doing. So how best were people? How are people? I'm trying to get out the question about how individuals work in this collaborative process best. Do you know what I mean? Sorry, I'm being a bit inarticulate.
No. I think I get. I think in terms of, so one thing that we then changed was to make, because as you mentioned, that dissonance and that discord is good, because that's where the challenge lies, that's where the discussion happens, and that's when things start to change, hopefully for the better. So one thing that's, I suppose, changed in the last couple of years is the way in which we now do the collaborative planning is ever so slightly different. In the, harking back to what I was talking about earlier with the group coming together, discussing the ethos, the next step of that is to go back to me, I suppose, is I would then take away that information about the discussion, lots of notes, lots of discussions that we've had, and turn that into something a little bit more viable in terms of a structure for a particular unit. So we've moved away from each unit just belonging to 1, 2 or 3 people, where you could end up with something, as I've said, which is a little bit stale in the sense that it can be quite repetitive throughout, and it's just constantly that one particular person's driven, thoughts, and they've decided what knowledge is going to go into that. We've moved to much larger department discussion about what's going to go on, to start with the knowledge organizer, which I know you've mentioned previously. So we discussed what's going to go on the knowledge organizer, and then I would take that information away and allocate / ask people which element they are happiest to work on. So within a Key Stage 3 curriculum, that might mean that they want to look at a particular story or a particular tale. Say we're doing Chaucer's tales, they might pick a particular tale. We've mainly used this at the moment in Key Stage 4, so with Romeo and Juliet and Jekyll and Hyde, and they might have a really strong desire to talk about secrecy in Jekyll and Hyde, or it might be that they've done some brilliant work previously on the context and the opening, so they will be given that to look at. And so I think the key element here is that rather than giving an individual a huge amount of work to do of a 6, 7, 8, 9 week unit, even if they're working in 2 or 3, that's still a huge amount, giving them a much smaller area to focus on. So each of the teachers in the department are then just given, post all those discussions about what matters, what should be included, how it should be included, one particular area. In this case, say a chapter from Jekyll and Hyde. So I know that one of my jobs before I go back next week, sorry to everyone who's already gone back, one of my jobs next week is to finish my planning for chapter 5 of Jekyll and Hyde. I know that my lovely department have already done all of the other chapters, so I need to try and fill that gap. And I think the key thing there is giving responsibility for one area, but you've had so much input beforehand collaboratively, so that area that you're focusing on, you have a really clear pro forma as to what should be included, and then it's down to you to bring your expertise to that area. And
that person's really invested in that, presumably, as well.
Yeah, and that makes a massive difference, I think. So we've done this once already quite successfully with one unit, and now we're doing it in the second unit at the moment. And what we found was, or what I noticed, was going into the staff room, people were talking about who did that lesson on that, or who found that resource and that piece of information that they put in. Oh, I didn't realise that. And what was so lovely was the compliments that people were giving to each other, because the time invested was used wisely. So rather than needing to spend, I think it's something horrific, like 25 or 30 hours that you would normally spend creating a unit of work if you were just individually tasked with doing that. You might spend 3 to 4 hours, including some of the planning time that we've got in the meetings, really focusing on one particular element and making that as brilliant as you can. And then you're extremely proud of what you've made, you've invested in that, but also you are relying on absolutely everybody else to do the same. So everyone's at the moment probably relying on me to finish my chapter 5, because I know that all the other elements are done to a very high standard. So I need to then up my game and make sure that they're done as well, because I've no doubt that everybody out there has at some time picked up a scheme of work and looked at it and thought, I don't understand this. I don't know how I'm supposed to teach this to my class. And it takes that element away because everybody has invested in it. Before we go and teach it, what we then do is come back together. And so the final meeting that we've just had before we broke up for Christmas was a meeting where we all came in with kind of our like draft work based on what we were going to be looking at. So I came along with the extracts that I've chosen to focus on from that chapter, some of the ideas that I would be, implementing in my lesson, the context that I plan to teach, just on notes and, taking the actual book in. And then we sat in groups of 3 or 4 or 5, I think some of the groups went up to 5, we had 3 groups altogether. And we just talked in a 5 about what we were planning to do. And that was before I sat down and opened any document on the computer or, started writing a lesson plan particularly, because I was saying, I'm going to look at this extract. Is that the best one for me to be looking at in order to teach this particular skill? And I have a wonderful teacher in my department, Dr. Commander, who said, well, have you thought about looking at this extract as well, or this particular line as well? And I was thinking, that's much better. I'll take that one. Thank you very much. So he's helped and in that element hugely. And then other people said to me, well, we've looked at letters in Romeo and Juliet, and your chapter in Jekyll and Hyde is all about the letter. Why don't we recap what we did about letters in Romeo and Juliet here?
Yeah.
And those conversations are invaluable.
So everyone being present in the room actually had a huge, even though there's a time cost, there's actually an output and an outcome benefit. And you've mentioned there's something that's really interesting there about the extracts, which extracts, because I think often we overlook that. You think, oh, well, it's a good extract, they can do something with this. Well, actually, is that a good enough reason to pick it? Probably not. Probably you want to be looking for the extract that's got 3 really key quotes that they could use elsewhere in the novel, a real turning point in the novel whereby something that was referenced earlier is altered. There's so many ways in which you can split an extract. And I think probably left to our own devices without that collaboration, we perhaps just go, I like that one. And that's not really good enough.
Exactly. I think those conversations are invaluable. They do take time. So I think it is about making sure that you are asking people to use their time as wisely as possible. We've cut back on other things that we're doing in order to ensure that our curriculum is correct, because in my belief, if that isn't right, then there's no point in spending lots of time planning whizzy jazzy lessons if the basis of what you're doing isn't correct. And the collaborative element of it can come in many ways, but I think we need to be careful in this sort of digital world where it's so easy, and I'm definitely guilty of this, and I know my department will say, of sending an email and thinking that that's something that's done. That's not done. That's not really shared. The nuances that we give, in discussion and the debates that we have are so much more powerful and have saved me a lot of time. I know it's very risky that I haven't finished planning that lesson a couple of days before the end of term. However, in my head, it's all there and on my notes, it's all there because we've had those discussions. We've talked about it. I'm probably going to make a number up now that doesn't make any sense, but I imagine give me an hour of actually concentrating and not being in Christmas mode anymore, then I would be able to actually plan that lesson fairly easily. If we had never had those discussions, if we had never in September decided what should be included in our lessons and in what order and what the key questions should look like, then I would really struggle, and I would probably end up creating a much more, well, a substandard lesson, focused purely on, as you said, you know, what can you do with this extract, rather than thinking much more carefully about what knowledge do we want them to have. Well, we've talked about those key elements. I've got them in the knowledge organizer in front of me, so I know I have to reference that, which is already created. So I use that as my starting point. And those discussions have been absolutely invaluable. So I think, you know, time, true collaboration and not sharing is absolutely vital. Making sure that you are open when you bring your work along to these groups, to those changes. A big change that I've seen through this process and this idea of becoming truly collaborative is you become less precious about your work. You have pride in what you're giving to the group, but you become much less precious. I remember years ago as an NQT sitting in a room, and it was a wonderful team when I started, absolutely brilliant group of teachers around me. But they had invested so much time and effort into creating one unit of work that if anyone was to suggest that they shouldn't do that anymore, I just remember the most horrific arguments. I mean, everyone was friends afterwards, but people were so caught up in, fair enough, they'd spent 30, 40 hours of their life creating a unit that 80% of people didn't like teaching. So it wasn't successful in terms of imparting any knowledge to the students because people weren't using it properly. It's much better to put in the time to truly collaborate, to consider before that collaboration exactly what everybody must include, the non-negotiables. And once those non-negotiables are laid down, then everything else seems to flow from that point. So what we've managed to do is take away that element of fear that someone might judge your lesson or your element of teaching, because you're still very free to be you know, yourself in the classroom as you're teaching it, and you know, the way in which you express yourself. But what I really like about it as a head of department is I can walk around the department now, in the times that I'm lucky enough to do that, and all the students in the same year group are getting the same good deal. And I know that they can then come out of those rooms, and I know that this has happened, and they talk to each other about what they're learning now, and they say, oh yeah, we did that too, but you know, we talked about this as well. And they're having, the students are then starting to collaborate more. And I think that's a huge benefit.
That's so important. And there's a few things that you've mentioned. There's about 5 different tangents. That's probably a discussion for a different time, maybe. But you know, what you've just said there is so true. And I remember myself being a really sort of cynical 15, 16-year-old, but still going away and discussing what we'd just done with people in the top. Oh, what have you just done in top set? Oh, da, da, da. And actually, that was brilliant. Even though I thought I was being really cynical and probably thought I was being really cool, I was still talking about the work because it was a common shared ground. And something else you've said there that I think is a definite takeaway point for everybody, as well as all this, the larger ideas about curriculum design, how to be part of a collaborative process, how to orientate a collaborative process, is actually that thing about being precious. Because it went a bit Buddhist at one point there. You almost landed sort of, you know, drifting into a different sort of realm. But no, like, I like that, because actually this isn't your lesson. Lose that idea. It's a lesson. How can this lesson be the best lesson it can be? And that's actually something that comes with, I think, probably feeling quite secure in your department, but also quite secure in your teaching as well. That, yeah, listen, you guys are all talented. I'm okay. You're okay. We'll work this out together. There's something about that actually is very powerful for the students. There's a million and one things that we could go into. I've got loads of questions about which knowledge. I've got loads of questions about, you know, perhaps whether some members of staff would feel shut in by that. I think you've dealt with some of those, but those feel like a discussion for a very, very long and very different chat. But Jen, thank you so much for talking to us about that process of collaboration, because actually, you know, that's something that in my department we're really lucky to have a head and second who are really for collaboration, want everyone involved, and I feel it's a really effective way of designing a curriculum, because you are all experts in so many different areas, and you know, if you don't have those sort of sacred cows that must be taught, and everything's up for debate, I think you end up with a stronger and more rigid curriculum.
Yes, and that's the aim really overall. Can I just add, there are a couple of things. Obviously, curriculum is huge, and we've only talked about the collaborative element of it, which is fairly general, but we think very important. But there are a couple of things that I'm just going to look like I'm on Blue Peter now. But Summer Turner's book is, I don't know if anyone's if you've read it, I'm sure lots of people have, but this is fantastic if it comes down to you're redesigning a curriculum. It's fairly new, but and I didn't read this until we started looking at our Key Stage 4 curriculum, but it's absolutely brilliant. She really breaks down all the different theories behind curriculum planning. And, you know, I'm lucky enough to met Summer a couple of times, and I think we're of the same mind in the sense that it's down to what depends on your school, in your environment, for your students. It isn't about necessarily, I don't believe, adopting an ethos that doesn't fit with everything else that's going on in your school. You need to be aware of what's actually going around you without just stealing ideas that look great elsewhere. So that book is absolutely brilliant. And also, I've got a library here. Tom Sherrington's book at the moment, The Learning Rainforest, has a really good, I know another debate for another time, a really good debate sort of chapter here about curriculum design, and particularly sort of like the progressive traditional debate going on there. But that is a really good one. So if you're looking to redesign the curriculum as a whole, I would definitely encourage people to do it collaboratively, but also have a look at those texts beforehand, because they were so helpful in terms of absolute basics.
And that was the last thing that I'd written on my phone as a note. What was this reading? So you've answered that as well.
Okay,
thank you so much. Really useful, and so informative, particularly actually for heads of department, but actually as well for people who, like myself, are a teacher in a department, and I think about, you know, how does that journey, how does it all get pieced together? Because actually, I think knowing the journey that a head and the second in the department have to make those decisions actually is really important to a lot of people. As I said, fortunate enough to work in a really collaborative department myself, but you know, sometimes there may be people who aren't in that situation, who it might be nice for them to kind of know where all of this is coming from, and then perhaps understand a little bit more that journey. So thank you for that, and some really good takeaways. Thank you, Jen.
Thanks. Bye bye.